He's written many books on all various aspects of different battles involving cavalry troops. And it's a pleasure also tonight, in addition to Eric, he has his wife Susan here with us as well, so thank you very much for coming. And he and his wife live in Columbus, Ohio, as Eric says, with their 3 silly golden retrievers. Is that right? I had a golden once. I'm not sure she was silly. I think she was crazy. Anyway.
That works too.
Yes. And Eric is a big Philadelphia Eagles football fan, so he's also looking forward to the kickoff of the new season. But before that, let's get to his talk and the topic of the evening, and that is Little Phil, a reassessment of the Civil War generalship of Philip H. Sheridan. Please welcome Eric Wittenberg.
First off, it's always a challenge for me to follow Brian Wills. I always end up seeming to have to go after Brian, and you know, you spend enough time around Brian, you know that he could probably do stand-up comedy if he really wanted to. So it's difficult to follow that. So here I go again, following Brian Wills again. Abigail, at the risk of embarrassing you, I want to simply say that I travel the country a lot doing these types of programs. I've probably done 35 of them this year. I've got several more to go. I see way too much gray hair and way too little dark hair in the rooms where I do these talks. So it's a pleasure to see someone your age here, and I hope that you will continue to pursue your studies and continue to be active and continue on, because you are the future of what we're trying to do. So please keep up with it. Well, thank you for your hospitality. It's a lovely facility. It's always great to follow Brian, as I said. It's a challenge. And it was a pleasant drive down here. We're going to use the opportunity to take in a few sites while we're here, so it's a good thing. I want to talk to you a little bit about Philip Henry Sheridan. And if you're here expecting to hear me sing this man's praises, you're in the wrong room. This is not going to happen. What I'm trying to do here, in fact, is to cause you to think. And if you walk out of this room this evening having reassessed your opinions, and I don't necessarily expect to convince you, but if you walk out of here this evening having reassessed your ideas and your thoughts, well, then I've accomplished what I set out to do. So I'll ask you to keep what I have to say with an open mind, hear it with an open mind, and you can draw your own conclusions. Now, this is Phil Sheridan. He was born on March 6th, 1831, which leads to a very interesting statement. See, it seems that one of Mr. Sheridan's real personality traits that doesn't speak well of him is he had really bad allergies. He was really allergic to telling the truth. If you ever want to read one of the great works of fiction that's ever been published, sit down and read Phil Sheridan's memoirs. The lies begin in the very first sentence of the book. Because the first sentence of the book says, I was born in Albany, New York on March 6, 1831. Well, that's not true. Sheridan was actually born in County Cavan, Ireland on March 6, 1831, the day before his family left to come to the United States. Now, why would he lie about such a thing?
He won for president.
That's right. In the 1880s, not long before he died, he was pondering the possibility of running for president. And as has become painfully clear through the travails of the last 6 years with our current president, you probably all know that if you're not United States born, you're not constitutionally eligible to run for president. So the lies in Sheridan's memoirs begin literally in the first sentence of the book. So the best thing I can tell you about Sheridan's memoirs are, it's a work of fiction, makes a great doorstop. If you're looking for candor, if you're looking for the truth, you ain't going to find it there. But this at least gives you some idea who we're talking about. Sheridan was born, like I said, in County Cavan, Ireland, He and his family came to the United States. They settled first in Albany, New York, where they lived for a couple of years, and then the family relocated to a hardscrabble town. It's about 50 miles from where I live in Ohio, called Somerset, which is the county seat of Perry County, Ohio. Somerset was a little enclave of Irish Catholics. They were there working on the construction of the National Road, which passed, 10, 12 miles away. And there's this just very tight, small conclave of Irish Catholics that developed there. Sheridan grew up in a hardscrabble type of an environment because of that. But he was bound and determined to become a soldier. And finally, he was appointed to West Point in 1848 to be a member of the class of 1852. This is a photograph of Sheridan that was taken along with his roommate from West Point, who is George Crook. That's Crook on the right. Sheridan's the little chunky fellow in the middle. Abe Lincoln once described him as being a short, chunky, brown little fellow who could scratch his ankles without bending over if he chose to do so. Sheridan was 5'5", and probably in those days weighed 130 pounds, dripping wet with a rock in his pocket. And by the end of his life, he weighed about 240, so you can imagine what he must have looked like at 5'5". It actually prompted George Crook to describe of Sheridan about the time that he died, or very shortly after he died, talking about his bloated little corpse. So that ought to tell you something. Sheridan does not do terribly well at West Point. He graduates in the middle of his class, but he's going to demonstrate while he's at West Point one of the personality traits that will cause him a great deal of difficulty through the course of his career, which is an insubordinate streak as wide as this room. While a cadet at West Point, during his third year, he had an encounter with Cadet Sergeant William R. Terrell. And Terrell gave him an order, and Sheridan didn't like it, and he actually lowered his bayonet and threatened to run Cadet Sergeant Terrell through with the bayonet. Well, he immediately thought better of that and realized this would be a really bad idea. So he instead pulled his bayonet back up, but the next day he and Terrell had a fist fight. And Sheridan, instead of being expelled, which he probably should have been, was instead suspended for a year and went back home to Somerset and spent a year working on hard labor because there was no other thing for him to do. So it meant that he would not graduate with his class. He did not graduate with the class of 52 like Crook did. He will instead graduate as a member of the class of 1853, where he will graduate 16 out of about 48. He will end up as an infantry officer, and he will end up stationed in the far Pacific Northwest of the United States. Now, what is the single saying that Phil Sheridan is best remembered for? Come on, this is interactive. Feel free.
Only good Indians are dead Indians.
That's very close. What he actually said was, and what the gentleman in the back said is, the only good Indian is a dead Indian. It's very close to what he said. What he actually said is, the only good Indian I ever saw was dead. Close enough. So would it surprise you to learn that this man who said the only good Indian I ever saw was dead used to spend his nights in the Pacific Northwest in the arms of an Indian maiden? Trait number 2, hypocrisy. So, the regular army in the years prior to the American Civil War was a difficult job. You often ended up in unpleasant places doing unpleasant duty, and it led to a lot of people having problems with alcohol. Grant, in fact, had a great deal of difficulty with alcohol during his pre-war regular army career because it was sheer boredom. There wasn't much else to do. Grant was a lightweight anyway. Sheridan, on the other hand, being an Irishman, was a drinker. And he liked his tea, and he liked it a lot. And this will be a problem for him during his regular army career as well. Well, with the outbreak of the Civil War, he will end up being commissioned as a captain. He gets promoted to captain, is assigned to the staff of Henry Wager Halleck, who is at the time the General-in-Chief of the Armies of the United States. And he's assigned to Halleck's staff as a combat engineer. Now, this is good duty. It's a good job. Sheridan does a good job of it and catches Halleck's eye. And because he catches Halleck's eye, Halleck marks him as a guy who he thinks might be someone who is worthy of promotion, and he keeps looking for an opportunity. Well, an opportunity will present itself. But keep in mind, Sheridan graduated in 1853. The war broke out in 1861. So his regular army career prior to the war is 8 years. All 8 of those years are spent in the infantry. All of them. He has a few months as a combat engineer, and then in the spring of 1862, when an opening developed in the 2nd Michigan Cavalry, colonel had to resign his commission for health reasons, they picked Phil Sheridan to become the commander of this regiment. Now, the man has never commanded cavalry a day in his life, but they make him the colonel. And then, about a week later, the colonel of the other regiment that the 2nd Michigan is brigaded with goes on sick leave. So Sheridan, who has 1 week of experience commanding cavalry, finds himself in command of a brigade of cavalry. He actually does rather well. He beats Earl Van Dorn in a place called Boonville in Mississippi in an engagement there. And again, he's marked for as a guy who is going to perhaps go places. So his tenure in command of the 2nd Michigan Cavalry lasts 60 days. Okay, so keep that in mind. He's then identified as an up-and-comer by William Stark Rosecrans, the commander of the Army of the Cumberland, who arranges for Sheridan to be promoted to Brigadier General and assigned to command a division of infantry in the Army of the Cumberland, just in time for the summer campaigning season, and in particular for the Confederate invasion of Kentucky that takes place in October of 1862. So he's now gone from commanding a small brigade of 2 small regiments of cavalry to a division of infantry in no time flat. Rosecrans really liked Sheridan. He said that he was an officer who was worth his weight in gold. So, of course, the Confederates invaded Kentucky in the fall of 1862, and there is a large battle that takes place at Perryville, Kentucky in October. This is General Charles Gilbert. Now, Gilbert's an interesting story in and of itself. Gilbert had been nominated to become a major general, but his promotion was not confirmed, and in fact, it never was. His actual rank at the Battle of Perryville was sort of an honorary major general, but his real rank was he was a captain in the United States Army, in the regular army. But he's acting as a major general, and very shortly after the Battle of Perryville, and I'll tell you why in a second, his confirmation as major general is rejected, and he ends up resigning his commission and going away. And that's why you never hear of Charles Gilbert again after the Battle of Perryville. But Gilbert, it commands the Corps, which is the 3rd Army Corps of the Army of the Cumberland. I'm sorry, this is now the Army of the Ohio, and Sheridan's been assigned to command a division in 3rd Army Corps of the Army of Ohio, commanded by Major General Don Carlos Buell. Now, the summer of 1862 and the fall of 1862 were brutally hot and extremely dry in Kentucky. It was a drought summer. Water was at a premium. An army needs logistics. Part of logistics is making sure there are adequate supplies of water for men and animals. So whoever controlled water sources, that was something that armies would jockey for position for. And near Perryville, Kentucky, is a creek called Doctor's Creek. And Doctor's Creek, well, it was low because the drought was not dry, and it became the object of both Bragg's army as well as Don Carlos Buell's army. Now, Buell will give Charles Gilbert specific orders: do not bring on a general engagement. Gilbert, in turn, will give Phil Sheridan specific orders: do not bring on a general engagement. What does Sheridan do? He brings on a general engagement at Perryville. He doesn't like his position, so he orders his command to move forward to take so it has possession of Doctor's Creek, and when that command moves forward, it runs into, rather literally, the Army of Tennessee. And what starts out as a small skirmish over Doctor's Creek ends up being a full day of full-scale, full-blown combat, exactly what Sheridan was ordered not to do. Now, one of the things that Sheridan didn't get to do at West Point was to kill William R. Terrell, even though he wanted to. Well, he did at Perryville, because it was his command that got chopped to pieces by the Confederates, and Terrell ended up getting killed in the action that day, all because Phil Sheridan disobeyed an order and brought on a general engagement. So Sheridan finally got Terrell. It just took him a while. Not long after the Battle of Perryville, Confederates will withdraw back into Tennessee. Don Carlos Buell will be relieved of command of the Army of Ohio. Sheridan will be transferred back to the Army of the Cumberland as the Army of the Ohio's units are parceled out to the rest of the Army. This is Major General George H. Thomas, obviously the Rock of Chickamauga. I'm sure he's a familiar name to all of you who live in northern Georgia. His great day, of course, was September 20th, 1863 at the Battle of Chickamauga. Sheridan will end up commanding a division under George Thomas, the 14th Army Corps. And, of course, this is the time he was Major General Ulysses S. Grant. He hadn't been promoted yet. He gets promoted in the spring of 1864. But he is not only commander of the Army of the Tennessee, in the fall of 1863, then gets promoted basically to department command, where he commands all of the U.S. Army troops in the Western Theater. And as you know, after the Battle of Chickamauga, there were a great deal of difficulties for the Army of the Cumberland. It will be driven off the battlefield. Now, Sheridan actually did something at Chickamauga that probably saved his career. He was one of the units that bugged out in the afternoon of the 20th of September. And when his command bugged out, Sheridan actually was on his way to Chattanooga with a retreating command. Something told him, turn your command around and take it back to the battlefield. And he arrived on the battlefield just as the climax of the fighting was taking place on Horseshoe Ridge, where Thomas will earn his sobriquet of the Rock of Chickamauga. And I'll suggest to you that had Sheridan not returned to the battlefield, that probably would have been the end of his career. But by returning to the battlefield and re-engaging, he will end up salvaging his career, such that when the Army of the Cumberland is defeated at Chickamauga, it ends up retreating back to the bastion in Chattanooga, and Braxton Bragg, not knowing quite what else to do with the Army of the Tennessee, will end up besieging the Union garrison in Chattanooga. That in turn will lead to Rosecrans, who was Sheridan's great patron, being relieved from command and being sent to Missouri to chase after Sterling Price, which is what he'll do for the rest of the war. And Grant will come east from Vicksburg to Chattanooga to take command there. He will bring Sherman's army with him. So we now have both the Army of the Cumberland and Sherman's Army of the Tennessee, who are going to be looking to break the siege at Chattanooga. So after the Battle of Lookout Mountain, which was fought largely by the 20th Corps, consisting of made up of troops of the 11th and 12th Corps of the Army of the Potomac, and commanded by Major General Joseph Hooker, the plan is to develop an action where the Army of the Cumberland, which is of questionable reliability in Grant's mind, he didn't know the command very well, and it wasn't Sherman in command of it. It was George Thomas. Thomas was known as Old Slow Trot for a reason. He didn't move quickly. Sherman, on the other hand, had Grant's full confidence and full faith. So the idea was that Thomas's Army of the Cumberland is going to demonstrate against the main Confederate position on Missionary Ridge, and by using that diversion to divert attention, Sherman will in fact deliver the decisive blow. Well, there's a big problem with this, because the geography up there at Chattanooga, if you haven't spent much time up there, is such that what we today call the Sherman Reservation up there is actually a separate hill. But when you look at it from below, it looks like it's part of the same hill. So when Sherman attacks, he not only runs into Irish Pat Cleburne's division, it's a separate hill, and his attack bogs down, and what's supposed to be the primary assault ends up going nowhere. In the meantime, the Army of the Cumberland advances, and it advances to the foot of Missionary Ridge, as it's been ordered to do. But the problem with this position at the foot of Missionary Ridge is it's a terrible place to be, because the Confederates are able to shoot down on these guys with both their muskets as well as with their artillery. So the guys from the Army of the Cumberland are taking casualties, and they realize this is no place to want to be, and without orders from anybody, elect on their own to attack up Missionary Ridge, because it's either fall back or go forward. And they weren't going to fall back after what happened at Chickamauga. So this very spontaneous attack takes place, and they begin climbing Missionary Ridge. And Grant actually turns to Thomas and says to him, "Did you order this attack?" Thomas says, "No, I didn't." And the implication, I think, of that is from Grant is that if the attack had failed, even though Thomas didn't order it, it would have been Thomas's hide on the line. Well, the attack succeeds. and the Confederates are driven off of Missionary Ridge. Phil Sheridan will lead his troops as infantry division up Missionary Ridge, personally from the front. Now, to give credit where it's due, he was a brave guy and he wasn't afraid to leave the front for the most part. We'll talk more about that later. And he ends up jumping on and straddling the barrel of a cannon. He's waving his hat and waving his sword to spur his men on as they end up going up Missionary Ridge. And at one point, that particular artillery piece had been fired at him, and he said he was heard to make a comment to the effect of, that wasn't very gentlemanly. So he ends up astride this gun barrel, and his troops end up helping drive the Confederates off Missionary Ridge. And Sheridan will claim credit for his troops being the first to reach the top of the ridge. Guess what? He wasn't. It was William B. Hazen's division got there first. But Hazen was a guy who was probably the most disliked officer in all of the Army of the Cumberland. Nobody liked William Hazen. He's a very capable, competent guy, but nobody liked him. So even though everybody realized it was Hazen's guys who got there first, because it was Hazen, they're like, yeah, we'll let Sheridan take the credit. And this is the kind of thing that happens throughout Phil Sheridan's career. He ends up being given credit for things that he does not deserve credit for. Grant notes this bandy-legged little Irishman and notes him as a guy who is aggressive and is a guy who might serve a purpose for him later. Well, during the winter of 1864, specifically in February, Congress reactivated the grade of lieutenant general with that special piece of legislation, and then specifically passed another bill promoting Ulysses Grant to the rank of lieutenant general, which puts him in command of all of the armies of the United States. Outranks everybody but the Secretary of War and President Lincoln. So he comes to Washington, and there's a great deal of discussion about what to do with the Army of the Potomac, and in particular what to do with the Army of the Potomac's Cavalry Corps. 1863 had been a brilliant year for the Army of the Potomac's Cavalry Corps. Let me just give you a quick snapshot of everything that transpired in 1863. At the beginning of the year, there was no Cavalry Corps of the Army of the Potomac. It did not exist. What happened was there were specific brigades of cavalry that were assigned to serve with specific commands amongst the Army of the Potomac, but there was no massing, there was no cohesive unit. And in what was probably the best single order that Joe Hooker ever gave as an Army commander, he ordered that all of the regiments of cavalry of the Army of the Potomac be massed into a single 12,000-man corps in February of 1863 under command of George Stoneman. These guys will fight the Confederates to a standstill at Kelly's Ford on March 17, 1863. They will go on an extended raid deep into the heartland of Virginia during what is the Chancellorsville campaign that's called the Stoneman Raid. Joe Hooker will blame George Stoneman for losing the Battle of Chancellorsville, and Stoneman, who had, and just as a quick aside, can you imagine being a career cavalryman, being a guy whose entire adult life was spent in the saddle and having an absolutely horrific case of hemorrhoids? Well, poor George Stoneman did, and every minute that Stoneman spent in the saddle was absolute agony. And I think that may factor into why, whenever you read descriptions of George Stoneman's personality, he's described as being very dyspeptic. So Stoneman ends up taking medical leave from the Army of the Potomac on May 15, 1863, and never returns to command the Corps. This in turn means that the 1st Division Commander, Alfred Pleasanton, is going to end up becoming the temporary commander of the Cavalry Corps. And under Pleasanton, who had a lot of really bad traits, but had one very good one, which is he had a really good eye for talent. But Pleasanton was a lead from the rear kind of guy who was most interested in Alfred Pleasanton, and anything else came second to that. You have the Battle of Brandy Station, fought June 9, 1863, the largest cavalry battle ever fought in the North American continent. 21,000 Union and Confederate cavalrymen slugging it out for 14 hours. You have the first defeat of Jeb Stuart's cavalry at the Battle of Upperville on June 21st, 1863. You have John Buford's epic stand on the first day of the Battle of Gettysburg. By the way, I know a good book about that. It'll be out in 3 weeks. You have the defeat of the Confederate cavalry on East Cavalry Field. You have 10 days of cavalry fighting during the retreat that leads to 22 separate engagements. And you have a nearly all cavalry campaign fought in the fall of the Bristow Station campaign. The Union cavalry has reached a point in the Eastern Theater where it is the equivalent of the Confederates. And then disaster strikes. The first problem that happens, John Buford dies of typhoid fever on December 16, 1863. The man who was by far the best cavalry officer the North had in any army, in any theater during the Civil War, and he is removed from the picture. Alfred Pleasonton, who by now has been made permanent commander of the Corps and promoted to Major General, forgets who his best friend in the Army is. His best friend in the Army was George Gordon Meade. Meade was loyal to a fault. And even though Pleasonton was very unpopular and was known as an intriguer and a toady, George Meade kept him in command. But Pleasonton went and testified before the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War in February of 1864 and stabbed George Meade in the back. Specifically, he testified before the Joint Committee that after the repulse of the Pickett-Pettigrew-Trimble charge on the afternoon of July 3, 1863 at Gettysburg, he went to George Meade and said to him, "General, I'll give you half an hour to prove yourself a great commander and order a counterattack." Now, I'll bet you my house, your house, and everybody else's house in this room that never happened. But this was Pleasonton's testimony. Meade was livid. And Meade at that point, who was Pleasonton's only supporter in the Army, withdrew his support. The next thing Alf Pleasonton knows, he's serving with William Stark Rosecrans in Missouri. Which means that now we need a new commander for the cavalry. So when Grant comes east to meet with the High Command, he has a meeting with Halleck, and the topic of who's to command the Cavalry Corps of the Army of the Potomac comes up, and Halleck suggests Sheridan. To which Grant says, just the man I had in mind. So let's remember, Phil Sheridan's experience in commanding cavalry is 60 days. Well, we've now got to replace the commander of the 1st Division. The commander of the 1st Division, there's George Gordon Meade. Just quickly, I'll point out to you that you never see him as he always was, which is he was terribly nearsighted, and he always wore glasses, but he wouldn't be photographed wearing them. And he had a terrible temper. I mean, just a horrible temper. And because he wore glasses, and because he had this temper, the men of the Army of the Potomac would refer to him as that goggle-eyed old snapping turtle. So anyway, back to the story. We need a commander of the 1st Cavalry Division. Well, instead of doing the smart thing, which is picking the senior brigadier of the command, which is Wesley Merritt, the commander of the Reserve Brigade, who is a brigadier general, very much John Buford's protege. Wesley Merritt will spend 43 years in the regular Army before he finally retires as the 2nd ranking officer in the U.S. Army. You will command the U.S. expedition that will capture Manila. And let me tell you, folks, Wesley Merritt was John Buford's protege and John Buford's legacy to the Army. He should have gotten command of that division. But instead, they give it to a fellow by the name of Alfred Thomas Archimedes Torbert of Delaware. Alfred Torbert is a guy he's a West Pointer, so he's got the proper training. But what you have to understand about Torbert is 2 things. Number one, at the beginning of the war, he was commissioned as an officer in the Confederate Army. He changed his mind, resigned his commission, remained loyal. He ends up as an infantry commander, and for most of the war, up until the spring of 1864, he commands a brigade of New Jersey infantry assigned to the 6th Corps. This is the guy that Sheridan is given as his 1st Division commander. Alfred Torbert. You know what Alfred Torbert's experience was commanding cavalry? 0 days. Never commanded cavalry in his life. In the meantime, in the winter of 1864, Judson Kilpatrick, the commander of the 3rd Division of the Army of the Potomac's Cavalry Corps, comes up with a harebrained scheme. And the harebrained scheme is, we're going to commit a raid on Richmond, the purpose of which is to free the prisoners of war at Belle Isle and Libby Prison and bring them back to safety. Well, To Alf Pleasanton's great credit, Pleasanton opposed it. He thought it was a foolish thing. But Abe Lincoln and Edwin Stanton approved it. So it happened. Well, needless to say, it was an epic disaster. One of the two commanders of the expedition, 22-year-old Colonel Ulrich Dahlgren, wasn't even 22 yet, he's 21 years and 11 months, ends up being killed. Found on his body are certain documents that suggested the real purpose of the raid was the kidnapping and assassination of Jefferson Davis and his cabinet and the burning of the city of Richmond. When these papers come to light, you can imagine the hue and cry that went up. The U.S. Army ended up disavowing Ulrich Dahlgren. It was an ugly episode. Well, the upshot of it is that Kilpatrick was relieved of command of his division and sent to William Tecumseh Sherman, who said of him, "Kilpatrick's a hell of a damn fool, but just the man I want to command my cavalry on this expedition." So the 3rd Division now needs a commander. Well, again, you want to put in somebody who deserves the job. I'm not a huge fan of George Armstrong Custer, but he was the senior brigade commander, and he had been a general officer for 7 months, had done rather well, and probably deserved it. Well, Grant decided he wanted this guy, James Harrison Wilson, to be the commander of the division. Now, Harry Wilson was a brilliant guy. He was a member of the West Point class of 1861. He graduated very near the top of his class. Was assigned as an engineering officer, and he served under Grant, particularly in the Vicksburg campaign, where he becomes known as Grant's pet. Keep in mind that when Harry Wilson is promoted to Brigadier General, given command of the 3rd Cavalry Division, he has never commanded anything bigger than a squad of cadets at West Point. What's more is, he and George Custer hated each other's guts. They had been at West Point together, they hated each other, and Custer said, "I outrank him, there are no circumstances under which I would serve under his command." So now we've got a big problem. So how do they fix it? They pick Custer's brigade, Michigan Cavalry Brigade, up out of the 3rd Division. They transfer him to the 1st Division, so he's not under Wilson anymore. And they move the brigade that had been commanded by William Gamble at the Battle of Gettysburg, which is now commanded by Colonel George Chapman, 3rd Indiana Cavalry. They pick that up and they move it to the 3rd Division, thereby solving the problem of Custer serving under Wilson. So let's recap, shall we? This Army of the Potomac Cavalry Corps that had done such good work in 1863 now finds itself with a Cavalry Corps commander who has exactly 60 days in grade commanding cavalry and has never commanded a corps before in his life. The commander of the largest division has 0 days commanding cavalry. The 2nd Division is commanded by David McMurtry Gregg, a very capable professional career soldier who commanded a division of cavalry longer than any other officer in the Union service during the Civil War. He was the one professional cavalryman in a position of rank. And then we have Harry Wilson here, Grant's pet, who has not commanded anything bigger than a company of cadets. Does this sound like a recipe for disaster? You bet. So with the coming of the spring campaigning season, the Army of the Potomac breaks its winter encampment. At the end of April of 1864, it has spent the winter camped in and around Brandy Station. The Army advances out of its camps and crosses the Rapidan River at Germanna Ford, headed directly for the old Chancellorsville battlefield. And who do you suppose is leading the way? Now, let's remember, the traditional role of cavalry, the thing that Jeb Stuart did better than anybody else: scouting, screening, reconnaissance. Scouting, finding the way. Screening, preventing the enemy from finding your army. Reconnaissance, gathering intelligence. These are the roles of cavalry. These are the things that cavalry does well. And in the system, the way it's supposed to work, when an army advances, the cavalry leads the way because it's both scouting and screening. Well, Sheridan, when he gives the orders for the army to march, when the army's giving the orders to march, Sheridan, instead of doing the smart thing, which is putting the one experienced division commander he has out in front of the army, Gregg, who does he put out there? Wilson. And Wilson's division will run into a single brigade of Confederate cavalry commanded by Brigadier General Thomas Rosser and will get thrashed. And they get routed. Which means that when the Army of the Potomac infantry enters the wilderness, it does so blindly, and it runs into Richard Stoddard Ewell's 2nd Corps at Saunders Field, and what starts out as a meeting engagement devolves into a general engagement. And we all know about the Battle of the Wilderness. It was a disaster for the Union, in part because of Sheridan making a bad call of putting Wilson's division out in front to lead the way. Well, the difference between Joe Hooker and Ulysses Grant, and Grant, by the way, had been traveling with the Army. His original idea was he was going to let Meade command the troops in the field, but he didn't like how Meade commanded his troops on the first day of the Battle of the Wilderness, so that arrangement lasted exactly 1 day. It was the 2nd day, Grant kicks in and starts giving orders himself. The difference between Grant and Hooker is instead of breaking off and withdrawing, Grant says, I'm going to make a sidling move around Lee, headed for Spotsylvania Courthouse. Now, the halfway point between the Wilderness and Spotsylvania Courthouse is a crossroads. It's the crossroads of the Catharpin Road and the Brock Road. And was there at the time a ramshackle tavern called Todd's Tavern. That critical road junction controlled access to Spotsylvania Courthouse. He who held that crossroads controlled the access to Spotsylvania. So on the 7th of May, there is an all-day slugging match between Union cavalry and Confederate cavalry commanded by Major General Fitzhugh Lee. Fitzhugh Lee being the favorite nephew of the commanding general of the Army of Northern Virginia, and the finest single instance of nepotism I have yet to find in the Civil War. Fitz Lee's a guy who, had he not been the favorite nephew of the commanding general, might have made a pretty good regimental sergeant major. Instead, he ends up being the final commander of the Army of Northern Virginia's Cavalry Corps. I've been studying Civil War cavalry operations for more than 40 years, okay? And in those 40 years, I've identified exactly 4 good days that Fitz Lee had in the whole war. Now, one of them happened to be May 7th, 1864. It was one of the 4. He conducts a brilliant delaying action, and his delaying action in Todd's Tavern actually is what allows Confederate infantry of Longstreet's Corps, now commanded by Richard Anderson, to get to Spotsylvania Courthouse just ahead of the Army of the Potomac. Well, Sheridan's off somewhere. We're not even really terribly sure where he is. So when George Meade arrives at Todd's Tavern, he finds 2 divisions of Union cavalry with their horses turned out, cooking coffee, writing letters, feeding their horses, doing what cavalrymen do when they have nothing else to do. Where's General Sheridan, he says. We don't know. What are your orders? We don't have any. So Meade sends scouts out to try and find Sheridan. They can't find him. So by this point, he's angry and frustrated. So he ends up giving orders directly to, Alfred Torbert was on medical leave, so Merritt was in temporary command of the 1st Division. He gives orders directly to Merritt and Torbert for them to, Merritt and David Gregg for them to move. Just as those orders come through, Sheridan shows up. And he gives orders as well. And the orders that he gives conflict with the orders that Meade gives. So now you've got all kinds of chaos going on. Sheridan stomps over to Meade's tent. He finds Meade there. Now remember, this is a hot-blooded little Irishman who was known to have a hell of a temper. And then we have George Gordon Meade. I've already told you about the goggle-eyed snapping turtle line. One of Meade's staff officers was a terribly witty fellow by the name of Theodore Lyman. Lyman left us a brilliant record of his service with the Army of the Potomac. And Lyman's memoirs specifically talk about Meade's language. He used to call Meade the Great Peppery because of his language. So you can imagine the titanic row that develops between Sheridan and George Gordon Meade. Now, first off, Sheridan's being insubordinate by getting into an argument with his commanding officer to begin with. And at the climax, and I'd love to have been a fly on the wall that heard this. At the end of it, Sheridan looks Meade square in the eye and says, you know what? From now on, if you want to give orders to the Cavalry Corps, go right ahead because I'm not going to do it. And he stomps right out of Meade's tent. In other words, he has just told the commanding general of the Army to go pound sand, being polite in describing it. Meade goes straight to Grant's tent. It's Meade's intention to relieve Sheridan of command, right then and there. But he knows that this is Grant's hand-picked Cavalry Corps commander, and that he can't do so without Grant's permission. So he describes this whole episode to Grant, who's sitting there doing what he did, which was whittling. And Grant, being a man of few words, says nothing. He just listens. And then Meade makes a big mistake. Meade says, and Sheridan says he wants to take the entire Cavalry Corps off to bring Stewart to battle. To which Grant looks up and says, well, Sheridan usually knows what he's talking about. Let him go right off and do it. What does this mean? This means that Grant has rewarded Sheridan's gross insubordination by giving him an independent command. It also means that for the rest of the war, it is all but impossible for Sheridan to serve with the main body of the Army of the Potomac under the command of George Gordon Meade. That's what the result of this is. And in fact, if you examine the record, until Sheridan is appointed to command the Middle Military District on August 8th of 1864, his troops are with the Army of the Potomac for a little over 30 days. Other than that, they're gone. Which has great implications for the rest of the Army. James Ewell Brown Stewart, commander of the Army of Northern Virginia's Cavalry Corps, 32 years old, West Point trained, known as being a guy who loved to sing, he liked the ladies, he liked to have a good time. He wore this outlandish hat with a big black ostrich plume coming out of it. He was known to sing his theme song, if you want to have some fun, join the cavalry. But make no mistake about it, friends. This man was one very serious, very capable, extremely professional soldier. In the years prior to the war, he served in the 1st U.S. Cavalry. His commanding officer there was a fellow by the name of Major John Sedgwick, who would go on to command a corps of infantry in the Army of the Potomac. Sedgwick himself said of Jeb Stuart, these are Sedgwick's exact words, he said, there was no finer cavalryman ever foaled on the North American continent than Jeb Stuart. So Sheridan goes off on a raid, and the object is to draw Stuart out and bring him to battle. And Sheridan takes his entire command, all 12,000 of the cavalry with him, leaving the Army of the Potomac with nothing but headquarters escort companies. They bring Stuart to battle on May 11th, 1864, a place called Yellow Tavern. Stuart is mortally wounded. Another one of his brigade commanders is killed outright. It is a Union victory. Stuart will die in Richmond the next day. Robert E. Lee said of him, he never brought me a false piece of information. Robert E. Lee, who was known for controlling his emotions and for being the marble man, as Thomas Connolly called him, wept when he heard of Stuart's death. Sheridan then loses his courage in front of Richmond. He was going to try and enter the defenses of Richmond, and he gets through the first layer of defenses, and the Confederate Home Guard comes out to meet him, and Sheridan loses his courage. So instead, what does he do? He figures, I got to get out of Dodge. So the next day, on the 13th, at a place called Meadow Bridges on the Chickahominy River, in one of the other 4 good days that he had in the war, Fitz Lee brings Stuart to battle, and it takes a close doing, and brings Sheridan to battle, and the Union cavalry is able to escape. And that's about all it was an escape. They end up down the peninsula of Virginia in Yorktown, completely out of the war. They left on the 8th of May. They don't return to the Army of the Potomac until the 22nd. So for 14 days, Ulysses Grant's army is blind. He has no cavalry. He blunders into the Confederate infantry at Laurel Hill at Spotsylvania. That devolves into a 6-day bloody slugging match, which Grant said, I will hold this line off if it takes all summer. Finally, they break off. Grant sidles around Lee's army again. Because he's got no cavalry leading his way, he nearly leads the entire army into a trap at Ox Ford on the North Anna River. Lee's army is on high ground overlooking the ford in a position that looks like this. It looks like a V. And And it is one of the strongest defensive positions you'll ever see. And by the way, if you get an opportunity to go out there, do some of those gorgeous earthworks you'll ever want to see. They're still there, and they're still in great condition. It's all been preserved, thanks to the mining company that owns the land that's out there. Only but for Gouverneur Warren, who had been ordered to lead the attack with his 5th Corps there, sees this Confederate position and says, no way. So Meade rides over to see what's going on. He's furious that his orders aren't being obeyed. Warren points out this position to him, and Meade says, yeah, okay, I guess you're right. And they end up calling off the attack. Another Seidel headed in the direction of Richmond. They soon find themselves pinned down in the same ground where George McClellan's 1862 Peninsula Campaign has bogged down. This is Wesley Merritt.